Hello everybody, in this video I'm going to be showing you how to tune up butt hinges to make them look nicer, work better and just make them easier to install. So let's get going. Alright, a couple of disclaimers to make before we start this video. Those of you that are wanting to just whack out hinge mortises, get the job done, maybe you're fitting out an entire house and you need to get it done in a day or something like that, this video is not for you. This is going to be far too finicky. I wouldn't even bother watching it. This video is mainly for furniture makers, cabinet makers who want to install these very precisely, no gaps at all, and have them work exactly as intended. Disclaimer number 2 is that this is not a video on how to install these hinges. It is simply a video on how to tune them up. However, if you want to know how to install them, I'm going to do a video afterwards. So these are butt hinges, very simple in their construction. You just got the 2 leaves and then a knuckle in the middle that joins them together. And then on these ones, we got 3 countersunk holes, but depending on the size of the hinge, they can be more than that. So when looking at a hinge, it's quite obvious to see this one is a rectangle. And upon first glance, it's quite easy to assume that all these corners are 90 degrees to one another, or right angles. How wrong you are. You see, if you go for hinges made by a company that make beautiful hinges like the ones installed in this box, then it's pretty safe to assume, wrong way, that the hinge is going to be of the best quality. Why is there a knife in there? Oh, I need to sharpen that. That's for my soup. What was I saying? Oh yeah. So if the hinge is made by a company like, let's say, Brusso or Andrew Crawford, then it's pretty safe to assume that the hinge is going to be of the best quality and it will not need to be changed at all. So these ones are made by Brusso. These are side rail hinges. This isn't the type we're going to be focusing on today, but you can see that that is of a very nice quality. The downside to that being they cost a lot of money. And because a lot of my projects are going to be based around cabinets for the workshop this year, I am not going to spend money on Brusso hinges for a workshop cabinet. That's a complete waste of money. So I go to the local DIY supplier, hardware supplier, and use their hinges. Now these are lovely and cheap. I paid a couple of quid for a pair of these, but let's have a look at them close up. So firstly, you may be able to see the gap in the middle of them. There's not really a whole lot you can do about that. One of my students once tried to bend the hinges and compress them together to hide that gap, but it didn't really have much an effect, to be honest. But on higher quality hinges, there will be no gap there at all, and the top and bottom of the hinge will be parallel to one another. And essentially what this gap means is when you're installing it in a door or a box or something like that, assuming you install these hinges so they are flush with the surface, by the time you get those edges parallel, there's going to be a gap created around the door or the box or whatever you're installing it in. So it's up to you to make that a consistent shadow gap around the whole door, or else it's going to look uneven. So that's problem number 1 with these hinges. The other problem you may have noticed is, can you see how the leaf on the bottom of this one here is poking out beyond the top leaf? This long edge here is not even. So on the end you're currently looking at, the bottom is sticking out. On the end that I'm at, the top is sticking out, which doesn't make it easy to achieve a clean installation with these. The other thing is the end of it, where you would ideally have a nice right angle edge coming down from this face, you can see that it looks somewhat rounded. It's definitely not as crisp as it could be on that corner, which means that when you cut the recess for these, you're going to get some weird like shadow gap or something around these hinges, and you'll never be able to get it right up against the edge of the timber. So to give you an exaggerated view of this, this is a paper hinge, pivot point on it, and you can see that the leaves are twisted. This top one is going off towards the camera. The bottom one is, don't even know what direction that's going. It's going back the other way. The leaves are twisted on it. You open it up, and as a result, the leaves are not parallel with one another. They are going off at an angle. So the first thing we need to do on these hinges is get that edge straight, which I'm going to show you later, but we'll just do it for the sake of this demonstration. We'll get that straight, and we'll be doing that with files later on. Lovely, we have got one edge that is perfectly straight. But now look at the ends. They are not square to this front edge. So if you open it up, you've got some sort of parallelogram action going on where both sides are parallel to one another, but they are not square. So that means when you recess these hinges, if you have a socket here that you push them into, the hinge is going to touch at the top, but create a gap at the bottom here. So as a result, we need to square off the sides of these as well. And there we go. That is what we're going for. Two sides that are parallel and at 90 degrees to each other without any twist in the leaves. So the way to fix this is to either get a second cut or am I going to get demonetized for saying this? This is the problem with YouTube. If they hear me say something that might be remotely offensive, then I don't get any ad revenue for this video. And that is how I keep doing free videos. One of those. It's incredibly coarse. It might be too coarse for the sake of this, but there we go. So what we need is a long bit of wood that is square on its edges. Clamp the file at the back like that and put it all together in your vise without crushing your fingers. Just make sure to get it low enough so that that file is definitely sitting square. And this is where I need a third hand. And now it's just a case of putting the hinge onto the wood and running it up and down that file. However, do you remember our previous problem that both those hinges were not sitting flush? So you've got a knuckle at the top with the two straight leaves coming off of it. Now this is going to be, yeah, it's definitely going to be an exaggerated view of it again, but you'll get what I mean by the end of it. So there we go, pivot point. The proportions of this are so far off. Right, so currently the setup we've got in the vise, the hinge is laying flat on a bit of wood. Let's just render that real quick. There we go. It's sitting flat on a bit of wood and we have a file clamped up at 90 degrees to that edge. See, it's definitely a file. And you can probably already see at this point what's wrong with this. On the bottom leaf, we have got a perfect 90-degree edge going on there. However, on the top edge, that is obviously not at 90 degrees to the file, which means we're going to be putting an angle on the edge of that leaf. Now, this isn't a huge problem because the angle that you're cutting that leaf at is actually going to be undercutting it, which would mean that the bottom edge isn't touching the inside of the recess, but the top edge, which is the bit you will see, will be touching the recess that you'll cut the hinge into. So you won't see any gap there, but you will know it's not square. And every single time someone compliments you on your hinge fitting in the future, you'll know that it's not right. And we can't have that. So what I tend to do is just pack the hinge out with a little bit of paper in order to make both those leaves parallel with one another. So in this case, I had to make up about 1 millimeter's worth of thickness. And once you've done that, you then get it on here and just work it side to side on the file. Just mind your knuckles when you do this because it really hurts when you catch it on that top edge, especially with one of these files. And you can already see on this hinge, just after a few passes, we're hitting that bottom edge there and the top edge here. So this hinge was definitely twisted, no doubt about that at all. Just a few more passes on the file will ensure that edge is perfectly flat. So this should only take a couple more passes, seeing as this file is so coarse. Don't forget that we're not only sorting out the twist of the leaves at this point, we're also getting rid of that horrible roundover on the edge of them as well. We're giving ourselves a nice 90-degree edge to work from. All right, so we've got the end of the file perfectly flat and is looking lovely. Now we've got to get the ends of them square to that face that we've just filed. Now we're going to be doing this with a shooting board style kind of thing. Word of warning, don't use your actual shooting board to do this because we're going to be moving that file back and forth. And the last thing you want is to gradually file your shooting board out of square. So all I'm going to do for this is make myself a rudimentary shooting board. And that's just a case of having a platform below with a fence that is square to this edge here. Now, because this is OSB, I have sanded off that corner because I don't fancy getting a splinter from it. So just get a square and adjust that back fence as needed. And because this isn't wood we're shooting, it doesn't really matter if this edge isn't right up against the edge of that. If you're doing this and you want to plain wood square, you need to make sure that that edge is in line with this one in order to prevent breakout on the back. But that's in another video. I'll put a link in the top corner to that. And then it's just a matter of overhanging that hinge from the edge, push the file up against the edge of this bit of timber and work the file back and forth. Now, because this file doesn't have a safe edge on it, and a safe edge is just a flat edge without any tooth on it, I'm going to put a bit of veneer underneath, which will work as a sled. So then push the file up against the edge and work it back and forth. And when you're doing this, it's really important to push that square edge up against the fence. Don't push the knuckle up against it because there is no real guarantee that those edges are parallel to one another. So now that edge is square to the face here, but you can see that because I used a coarser file, it's not as good of a finish as it could be. Now, you're not going to see the edge of the leaves on these hinges because that's going to be recessed into wood. However, you are going to see the top of that knuckle poking out a door or the back of the box or whatever. So I think it's worth going to a smooth cut or a second cut file after this just for just for laughs. And to protect this smooth file and prevent it from getting clogged with the OSB, like this one's just done, I might put a little bit there as well, which will act as a runner for it. And there we go. Now that hinge is perfectly flat and perfectly square to that flat face, and is going to make installation of this thing far easier. Now, those of you that are very observant will know that when we filed this first edge flat, there is no guarantee that it's going to be parallel to the knuckle side of the hinge. There's not, without making some complex jig, there's not really any way to sort that out. The best thing you can do to prevent those two sides from going out of parallel is just to take off as little material as you can, and then you've got less of a chance of filing an angle onto that and then put those two edges completely out of square. But in reality, as long as that knuckle isn't way off, it won't really affect the function too much if those edges are not parallel. The main thing we're looking for here is to make the recess easier to cut and more crisp when this hinge is fitted into it. All right, so realistically, you could just leave it here. That hinge is ready to install, but you've put so much work into all these edges to ensure it looks nice when it's installed. The top edge, or the top face, still looks absolutely minging. It's got the color of dried urine, not as nice as it could be. So what you could do with this is get a file on a non-slip mat, and then if it has a safe edge on it, that one there, smooth cut file, you could run it up and down that face to take this to a nice consistent shine. But the other thing with these hinges is that they might be a little bit bowed as well. So if you're filing it, what you can probably see is that it's filing there and there, which mean that that hinge does have a slight dish in it. And to be honest, you don't need to worry about getting that top face flat, because by the time you put the screws in, they're going to pull it flat anyway. The only thing you're going to achieve at this point, if you try and file that flat, is you're going to end up making this side of the leaf too thin and this side of the leaf too thin. So then the heads of the screws will not fit in there properly and they'll sit proud. So what we'll do instead is just sand it so you've got a nice finish on there. Now for this, you can't really use a block because one, it just has the same effects as the file. You'll end up polishing the front and back edges of it. And because you'll most likely be wrapping the sandpaper around a block, you'll end up hitting that knuckle. So what you kind of need to do is just do this by hand, but be very careful that you don't round over that edge. So here I'm just starting with 240 grit. Don't need to start with anything coarser on these, and just give it a light sanding over to give it an even scratch pattern across that whole hinge. And then at this point, you just take it as high up as you want to go. I generally stop, I mean, it depends what sandpaper I have, to be honest. I don't tend to go too high to a gloss finish. I much prefer having a satin sheen on hinges and hardware because that tends to match the finish that I put on my pieces. So stopping anywhere around 1,000 grit would probably be enough, but to be honest, 240 still looks okay. But of course, this is completely up to you. So now the leaves are done, the other thing I'll do is start polishing up that knuckle. So when you're doing this, you've got to fold them completely open to a 90 degree. And then as you're sanding it, you slowly close them in order to get full access to all those edges. And you can also do the outside edge here, because this is the part that's going to be seen the most. So here you go, here's where we're currently at after 240 grit. The knuckle is quite difficult to clean up because there's lots of like dips and things in it where the joins are. You've just got to keep going with this until it's a nice consistent sheen. The reason I'm showing you this on its own is because when you do this, you do lose a little bit of that brass-like colour. You can see that it still has that kind of look to it at the moment until I put it next to what we had originally. Now that thing looks like stainless steel, very yellow stainless steel at that, but you get the idea. You do lose a little bit of that yellowing, but especially in this workshop, I've got very white lights in here, so this looks a lot whiter than what it would in a normal environment. It's still got a brass look to it, but it's just not as antique looking and as this one. But the further up the grits we go, the better that colour is going to come back. So we'll just keep going. I'll start with a 320, then 400, and then maybe finish up with a couple of these micro mesh pads afterwards. And what I'll do is I'll get a little comparison going so you can see the different stages of the polish. So there we go, there's the different levels of shine you can go for. 240, 320, 400, and then this one I went from 400 to 1200, then 1800, which it needs a little bit more work, but you can see the general sort of polish you're going to get at the end of it. I think that looks pretty good and is probably as far as I would go. The only other thing we could do is maybe just put a bit of paste onto a strop on the edge of it and then work the hinge back and forth on that. And that really gives it a nice shine. There's the hinge that was sanded to 240 grit, and that is it next to the one that we bought from the store. So as we said, it's lost a bit of its colour, but at least it's a nice even shine all over it. And then this is the one that we've just done. It's still a bit grotty because my hands are grotty, but you can see what we've come from to what we've got at the end. It looks so much more professional and it's going to be easier to install. Who knew that something the equivalent of 50p could look so nice? And there we go. That is how you tune a bog standard hinge bought from a hardware supplier to something that is fit for purpose on our pieces of work that we take a lot of time and care to make. This has now earned its place there. So as a recap, put some paper between the leaves to make them parallel, file the first edge flat, and then shoot the two edges square to that flat edge. After that, go through the grits of sandpaper starting at 240 and go as high as you want. That's all it takes, about 20 minutes per hinge. It's not really a whole lot of time if you think about it in the grand scheme of a project, but it will look absolutely incredible fitted onto your piece afterwards. So in the next video, I'm going to be showing you how to install this very precisely, no gaps at all. And then later on, there'll be plenty of hinging in all the upcoming projects I have this year. So thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and got something valuable from it, then don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you in the next video. I don't know why I held the hinge up then.